hard work of taking care of one another, of welcoming people. All you have to do is talk to somebody who's come to Nebraska, who's moved here, and they'll tell you how generous and friendly their neighbors have been. All you have to do is talk to somebody who's come here, let's say, to watch the Colorado football team play Nebraska at Memorial Stadium, and they will say to you that Nebraska football fans are the best. Because politeness is our value. Rudeness is not a value of the people of the state of Nebraska. No one, even people who have said to me, I'm never going to, I'm not going to vote for you in this election, haven't been rude about it. No, one or two.
You're from out of state.
All I've gotten is an expression of the values of this state. And I do get asked a fair amount by people who say, well, hasn't Nebraska changed a lot? The party registration, people's opinions, and so forth. And I know that that becomes important in a campaign. But before you get your opinions on the matter, before you decide what your voter registration is going to be, the question really is what kind of values do you have? And those values haven't changed. They really haven't. And we're far more welcoming than the ads that are being run against you would seem to indicate. And we do have to think of ourselves that way. Think of ourselves as welcoming people. Think of ourselves as inclusive people. Because that's our value. We want all of us to be a part of this great state. We want all of us to be a part of our community. And there are times when we don't. And it's not so bad every now and then to fall off of course. But for the most part, we are welcome. For the most part, we all are inclusive. For the most part, we try to allow people who are visiting us, who have come here to work, to feel at home. I'm a candidate for the United States Senate for reasons actually connected to another value, which is duty. I simply could not sit on the sidelines looking at the troubles that this country faces without becoming a candidate for the United States Senate one more time. Yeah. Because I believe in social and economic justice. And it's not perfect. It's not possible for us to achieve perfection. But to desire to achieve perfection, to desire to try to make our laws more socially and economically just, is a good desire. It's a good thing to begin for society. It's very much connected to our values. Don't let anybody tell you that somehow we're not mainstream because we care about economic and social justice. It is connected, in my view, to the most important values of the state. But I also have to believe that the major problems this country faces are not going to be solved unless we can break out of partisan gridlock, unless we can break out of these caucuses that have made it exceptionally difficult for Republicans and Democrats to get together on the most contentious issues of the day. So first and foremost, I do promise not to be beholden to any caucus. In my case, I'll caucus for the Democrats. But I will serve what's in the best interest of the state of Nebraska. I will serve what's best in the interest of the United States of America, not the Democratic caucus, but what's in the best interest of the people of this state and the people of this country. Of the terrible suffering of the last 3 or 4 years that occurred, the financial meltdown of 2008 was a self-inflicted meltdown. It was self-inflicted as a consequence of greed, as a consequence of what I call crony capitalism, as a consequence of terrible regulation, and it inflicted almost unimaginable damage to families and individuals in our country. You think the damage, I mean, I've looked at the numbers, and I've talked to people who have lost their pensions, people who have lost their entire life savings, people who still are unemployed and can't find work, people whose mortgages are larger than the value of their homes, people who thought that home was going to be their biggest part of the American dream. A terrible amount of damage. And most importantly, the hope that people have that somehow democracy will lift the standard of their living and the standard of the living of their children as well. But we're struggling back, it seems to me. Americans are making an effort fight back and try to get out of this hole. I think it would be a terrible mistake for us to forget how we got in this mess and go back to the good old days of saying basically we're not going to regulate the financial industry. You don't have to worry about them. They're always going to do the right thing. They didn't do the right thing. They did the wrong thing, and millions of Americans suffered as a consequence. So I'm running, first of all, to bring the values of Nebraska back to Washington, D.C., where I think that they're needed. And perhaps most importantly of all the values is the value of our most famous senator, a Republican, George W. Norris, who came back to Nebraska after 2 terms, very disillusioned from the Senate. And we know very well that among the things that he did and was to come back and get our Constitution amendment so we have only a single house in the Nebraska legislature. I'm not going to propose that we abolish the House of Representatives. I may be proposing to change some of the representation, but I'm we abolish the House. But Norris did a second thing. Norris said that the Democrat and Republican caucus in the first part of the 20th century were a problem. And he got us to amend our Constitution so there are no caucuses in the Nebraska legislature. I came into office in 1983 and we were in a deficit. And I worked with the legislature to spending from year 1 to year 2. We set the rainy day fund, we have professional forecasting of revenue, we've got the legislature rather than the partisan board of equalization setting our tax rates, and a number of other reforms as well, and we still invested in our people, in education, transportation, and infrastructure. I don't believe it would have been possible to get it done if I had to work through either a Democrat or Republican caucus. I think it would have been exceptionally difficult to get it done. I think it would have been very, very difficult for the legislature to come to terms and try to provide free language support for the children of people here without documentation. It was a phenomenal accomplishment of a nonpartisan legislature to override the veto of the governor, who in this case was absolutely. I'm going to give you a short list of things that, as I've watched Washington for the last 11 years, bother me, and I guess they bother you as well. You hear everyone, every politician that gets up and gives a speech talks about our children and our grandchildren. You know, no, I care about our children and our grandchildren. Okay, fine, so are you putting your money where your mouth is? Or are you just being another windbag talking about something you really like? As I examine the hard truth of Washington today, there's far more concern with holding on to a chairmanship or acquiring a chairmanship than there is doing something good for our children and our grandchildren. There's so many issues. It is true, to accumulate $100 billion worth of debt every single month and pass that debt and the interest of that debt onto our grandchildren and our children, it's wrong. And everyone who looks at the facts knows that it's going to take budget cuts and it's going to take revenue increases to solve the problem. But we've just witnessed, we don't know what the results are, Republican primary, where again, they're promising not to do anything on the tax side. Now recall, in 1990, and I'll talk about it a lot in this campaign, George Herbert Walker Bush, who got far too little credit for balancing the budget, said this: "I know I said no new taxes rate my lips, but voodoo economics will not work. It never has worked and it won't work." Said, I'll support tax increases if the Democrats agree to spending restraint. And we did. And all we did in 93 and 97 was to amend that act. And by the end of the century, we were paying off debt, heading to be the largest creditor nation on earth. That was the status quo when I left on the 2nd of January 2001. But most importantly, and I'll bring this to this campaign, it isn't just about balancing the budget. In the 1990s, the rates of poverty in the United States of America went down. In the 1990s, median family income went up. And if those two things aren't happening, I don't care if the budget is balanced. This country is going to change in ways that nobody is going to like. Democracy has to offer hope and promise to all Americans. I will give you another issue that probably isn't as good or qualified. You cannot say that you care about economic and social justice and say that the two most important programs that we have today, Social Security and Medicare, don't have to be changed. Because right now, everybody under the age of 40 is either going to have substantial cuts in their benefits or big increases in taxes for their children. That's current law. It isn't right. It isn't fair. And we have to make a change in ways that preserve, particularly for those who are most vulnerable, preserves the program. Both these programs have become more important than they were 10 years ago as a result of what's going on in the marketplace. But it isn't right to presume that people over the age of 65 cannot take the truth about what these two programs are and the changes that have to be made if their children and grandchildren are as important as we say they are when we give our speeches.
Yeah.
Mention another issue, that, and all these in some ways are sort of losing political issues. I'll mention another one that people right now become afraid to do anything about. It's climate change. Look, we know that it's getting warmer. You only need high school chemistry. You don't need to be a Nobel laureate to understand the science of it. We're pushing close to 400 parts per million of carbon, and it's going to be 500 in another 10 or 15 years, and it gets to 500. The semi-arid high plains are going to be arid. And I know from watching the primary, that the Republicans think that cap and trade is a job-killing proposal. If you think cap and trade is a job-killing proposal, where do you see this state go from semi-arid to arid? Look what happened in Texas last year. $9 billion worth of economic value were destroyed as a consequence of that drought. Now, I don't know what the answer is at the moment, but I know one of the answers, the most important answer that isn't correct, is doing nothing. Because if you do nothing on this, nothing on this one, you can't get it back. It'll take 1,000 years to get it back. It's not like the other two problems. And so we'll talk about this a lot in this campaign. Anyway, my prescription here, I see I've got like 14 different pages. Since I gave my son very good advice at the beginning, I'm not going to give Paul Johnson heartburn by putting this thing up. Look, I do think fundamentally that the rules of Washington have to change. I think George Soros is 100% right.
Yes.
I have a great deal of respect for men and women who serve in the Congress, but I have almost no hope, strike almost, I have no hope that they're going to be able to change these rules on their own. I do think it's time for us to actually examine whether or not our Constitution does need to change. And I will propose in this campaign that we change it to eliminate the caucuses, much like the nonpartisan legislature is. I will propose that we change it in a fashion that imposes some kind of limitation of terms. It has not been a problem, as was predicted for the Nebraska legislature. And I will most importantly propose, and you cannot do the first two without doing the third, that we change our Constitution and prohibit these unlimited, undivided